The dust devil that swept through the canyon on that scorching July afternoon in 1878 carried with it more than just sand and dried sage. It carried the sound of a woman's desperate cries, echoing off the red rock walls of the New Mexico badlands, 12 miles south of the rough-hewn settlement of Bismarck that had sprung up near the territorial line. Thomas Bradley reined in his bay, gelding at the crest of the ridge, his weathered hand coming up to shield his gray eyes from the brutal sun as he squinted toward the ravine below. He had been riding fence line on the western edge of his spread, checking for breaks in the barbed wire that kept his small herd of cattle from wandering into the unforgiving wilderness. At 34 years old, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade carving out an existence in this harsh land, building his ranch from nothing after mustering out of the cavalry. The work was hard, the loneliness harder, but he had convinced himself he preferred the company of horses and cattle to people who could leave or die or disappoint. The sound came again, carried on the hot wind a woman's voice, raw with fear and exhaustion. Thomas touched his heels to the gelding's flanks and guided the horse down the rocky slope, his right hand instinctively checking the Colt revolver at his hip. In this country, you never knew what you would find, and caution had kept him alive through more close calls than he cared to remember. What he found at the bottom of the ravine made his chest tighten with an old, familiar ache he thought he had buried years ago. A broken-down wagon sat tilted against a boulder, one wheel shattered beyond repair, the canvas top torn and flapping in the breeze. 2 mules lay dead in their traces, their bodies already beginning to bloat in the heat. And beside the wagon, kneeling in the red dirt, was a young woman with dark chestnut hair plastered to her face with sweat and tears, cradling the head of an older woman who lay motionless on a blanket spread across the ground. Thomas dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the earth with a soft thud as he approached with his hands visible and non-threatening. The young woman's head snapped up, and he saw fear flash across her face, a pretty face, he noticed despite the circumstances, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of amber honey that were now red-rimmed from crying and squinting against the sun. "Please," she gasped, her voice hoarse and cracking, "please help us. My mother, she needs water, medicine. We have been here since yesterday morning. Our wagon broke, and Father," her voice caught, and she gestured weakly toward a mound of rocks about 50 yards away, where someone had clearly attempted to bury a body. Thomas knelt beside them, his knees protesting slightly as he studied the older woman. Her breathing was shallow and labored, her skin pale and clammy despite the heat. He recognized the signs immediately: dehydration, probably heat stroke, and from the way she lay so still, possibly internal injuries from whatever accident had befallen them. "My name is Thomas Bradley," he said quietly, uncorking his canteen and handing it to the young woman. "Drink first, then give her small sips. Not too much at once or she will be sick." The young woman took the canteen with trembling hands, raising it to her cracked lips. She drank deeply, and he did not have the heart to stop her even though he knew she should pace herself. When she lowered the canteen, tears were streaming down her dusty cheeks again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. I am Celia Owens. This is my mother, Margaret. My father died 3 days ago, snake bite, and we were trying to reach Bismarck to find a doctor, but the wagon broke, and the mules bolted and crashed us into this ravine. Mother hit her head, and she has not been right since. I tried to walk for help yesterday, but I could not leave her, could not find my way, and I was so afraid." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if she had been holding them in for too long. Thomas gently took the canteen and trickled a small amount of water between the older woman's lips. Margaret's eyelids fluttered but did not open. He had seen enough dying to know the signs, and his heart sank with the weight of what he would have to tell this young woman. "How old are you, Miss Owens?" he asked, though he continued to focus on her mother, not wanting to meet those desperate honey-colored eyes. 22, Celia answered, her voice steadier now that she had water and was no longer alone. "We were traveling from Kansas. Father heard there was good land to be had in New Mexico territory, that a man could stake a claim and build something. We sold everything we had, and now," she broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas sat back on his heels and finally met her gaze. "Miss Owens, I need to be straight with you. Your mother is very ill. I have water and some supplies on my horse, and my ranch is about 2 hours' ride from here, but I do not think she can make that journey, not in her condition. I can try to make her comfortable here, or I can ride hard for Bismarck and bring back the doctor, but that would take most of the night, and I would have to leave you here alone again." Celia's face crumpled, but she nodded, understanding the unspoken truth beneath his words. Her mother was dying, and no amount of hope or prayer was going to change that fact. "Stay," she said softly. "Please do not leave us alone again." "I cannot." Her voice broke completely, and she bent over her mother, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Something in Thomas's chest cracked at the sight of her grief, at the vulnerability and courage she showed even in the face of such overwhelming loss. He stood and walked back to his horse, retrieving his bedroll, an old tarp, and the few medical supplies he carried in his saddlebags. He worked quickly, rigging up a sunshade over Margaret Owens's prone form, then wetting a cloth and pressing it to the older woman's forehead. "Tell me about your family," he said as he worked, partly to learn their story and partly to give Celia something to focus on besides the labored sound of her mother's breathing. Celia wiped her eyes and took a shuddering breath. "Father was a farmer. We had a small place outside of Lawrence, Kansas. After the war, things were hard. The grasshoppers came 3 years running and ate everything. We lost the farm to the bank last spring. Father said we would start over, that the West was full of opportunity for folks willing to work hard. Mother did not want to come, she was afraid, but she loved Father, so she followed him. And now she has lost everything," Thomas said quietly, "including him. Yes." The word was barely a whisper. Father was a good man, but he was not made for this country. He did not understand how unforgiving it could be. The snake that bit him, he thought it was just a garden snake. By the time we realized it was a rattler, it was too late. He lasted less than a day. I buried him myself as best I could. Mother helped at first, but then she just seemed to fade away, as if her spirit left with his. Sometimes that happens when people have been together a long time, Thomas said. He had seen it before, most recently with his own parents, though that was a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The heart decides it cannot go on without its other half. They kept vigil together as the sun tracked across the burning sky and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Thomas shared his provisions with Celia: dried beef, hardtack, and more water, and she ate mechanically, as if her body understood the need for sustenance even if her mind was elsewhere. He found himself studying her when she was not looking, noticing the determined set of her jaw, the way she constantly adjusted the cloth on her mother's forehead, the gentle way she stroked the older woman's graying hair. There was strength in Celia Owens, he realized. The kind of strength that came not from never breaking but from knowing how to put yourself back together when everything fell apart. He recognized it because he saw the same quality in himself, forged during the war and tempered by the years of solitude that followed. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Margaret Owens opened her eyes for the first time since Thomas had arrived. Her gaze was unfocused, distant, but she seemed to recognize her daughter's face hovering above her. "Celia," she whispered, her voice thin as spider silk. "My sweet girl. Mother, I am here." Celia clutched her mother's hand, bringing it to her cheek. "You are going to be all right. This kind man, Mr. Bradley, he is going to help us." Margaret's eyes drifted to Thomas, and for a moment clarity sharpened her features. "Take care of her," she said directly to him, the words requiring visible effort. "She is a good girl, deserves better than this, deserves a home." "Mother, please save your strength," Celia began, but Margaret was not finished. "Promise me," the older woman insisted, her fingers tightening weakly around her daughter's hand. "Promise you will not leave her alone out here. She has no one now. Promise." Thomas felt the weight of that request settle on his shoulders like an ox yoke, but he did not hesitate. "I promise, madam. I will see her safe." Margaret's face relaxed, and she turned her attention back to Celia. "Do not mourn too long for us, darling. Your father and I, we had our time. Now it is yours. Build the life we could not. Be happy, be brave." "Mother, no." Celia was openly weeping now, but she did not look away from her mother's face, did not try to deny what was happening. "I love you," Margaret breathed. "Always. Forever." Her eyes drifted closed again, and this time they did not reopen. Her breathing became even more shallow, the spaces between each breath stretching longer and longer, until finally, as the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, the breathing stopped altogether. Celia's keening wail echoed through the canyon, a sound so raw and primal that it made Thomas's eyes burn with unshed tears. He did not try to stop her or comfort her, knowing she needed to let the grief pour out. Instead, he stood and walked a short distance away, giving her privacy for those first terrible moments of realizing she was truly alone in the world. When her sobs had quieted to hiccuping gasps, he returned and knelt beside her. "Miss Owens," he said gently, "we need to see to your mother. It is not right to leave her like this." Celia nodded numbly and allowed him to help her to her feet. Together, they prepared Margaret Owens's body, washing her face and hands with what little water remained, straightening her dress, folding her hands across her chest. Then, as the moon rose over the canyon rim, Thomas dug a grave beside the one Celia had made for her father. The ground was rocky and difficult, but he worked steadily, his muscles burning with the effort. Celia watched in silence, and when the grave was deep enough, she helped him lower her mother's body wrapped in a blanket into the earth. "Would you like to say some words?" Thomas asked, standing beside her at the edge of the grave with his hat in his hands. Celia stared down at the blanket-wrapped form of her mother, her face pale in the moonlight. "I do not know what to say. I am so angry at them for bringing me out here, for dying and leaving me alone. But I love them, and I know they did their best, and her voice broke again. "I do not want to let her go." "Then say that," Thomas said quietly. "Say what is in your heart. They can hear you." So Celia spoke, her words halting at first but gaining strength as she went, telling her mother and father that she loved them and forgave them and would carry their memory with her always. When she finished, Thomas picked up the shovel and began to fill in the grave. And this time, Celia took a turn as well, both of them working together until the earth was mounded over and they had placed heavy rocks on top to keep scavengers away. By the time they finished, it was full dark, and Celia was swaying on her feet with exhaustion and grief. Thomas had already made a small camp with his tarp and bedroll, building a fire and brewing coffee in his battered tin pot. He gave Celia the coffee and made her drink it, then insisted she lie down and rest. "What about you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying and disuse. "I will keep watch," he said. "Sleep now. Tomorrow we will ride to my ranch and you can decide what you want to do from there." Celia studied him for a long moment, her honey-colored eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded and curled up in his bedroll without further protest. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, and her breathing deepened into sleep. Thomas sat by the fire, feeding it sticks and dried brush, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes called in the distance, and somewhere an owl hooted its lonely hunting cry. He thought about the promise he had made to Margaret Owens and wondered what exactly he had committed himself to. He could not just leave Celia in Bismarck with no money, no family, no prospects. The town was rough, full of miners and cowboys and men who would see a young woman alone as easy prey. But what were his alternatives? Take her to his ranch and then what? Hire her as a housekeeper, find her a position with another family. The truth was, he did not want to think too hard about his motivations. He only knew that when he looked at Celia Owens, something long dormant in his chest stirred to life. She made him feel something other than numb, other than resigned to his solitary existence. And that terrified him almost as much as it intrigued him. When dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of rose and amber, Thomas woke Celia gently and shared the last of his provisions with her. Then he helped her onto his horse, climbing up behind her, and they rode out of the ravine, leaving behind the graves and the broken wagon and the shattered dreams of a family that had come west seeking a new beginning. The ride to Thomas's ranch took nearly 3 hours because he kept the pace easy, not wanting to jostle Celia more than necessary. She sat stiffly in front of him, her spine straight, her hands gripping the saddle horn, and he was acutely aware of her presence, of the way she fit against him, of the scent of her hair despite the dust and the sweat. He told himself he was simply being considerate, that any decent man would do the same. But the lie rang hollow even in his own mind. As they crested the final rise and his ranch came into view, Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pride. It was not much a simple one-room cabin he had built himself, a barn for the horses, a corral, a windmill he had erected last year to pump water from the underground stream, but it was his. Every board, every nail, every fence post represented hours of backbreaking labor, of refusing to give up even when the land and the elements seemed determined to drive him away. "It is beautiful," Celia said softly, speaking for the first time since they had left the canyon. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it," Thomas said, trying not to sound too pleased at her reaction. "Still a lot of work to do, but it is coming along." He helped her dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment too long on her waist, then led the horse to the barn to unsaddle and water the tired animal. When he emerged, he found Celia standing in the yard, turning slowly in a circle as she took in her surroundings. The morning sun caught in her hair, turning it to burnished mahogany, and he had to force himself to look away. "You must be hungry," he said gruffly. "Come inside, I will make breakfast." The cabin was neat but Spartan, furnished with only the essentials: a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a stove, some shelves holding dishes and supplies. Celia hovered uncertainly in the doorway until Thomas gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit," he said, his tone gentler than before. "You are safe here. I gave your mother my word and I keep my promises." Something in Celia's rigid posture relaxed slightly, and she sank into the chair, her hands folded in her lap. Thomas busied himself at the stove, frying salt pork and eggs, warming beans, making more coffee. It felt strange having someone else in his space after so long alone, strange but not unpleasant. He found himself moving more carefully, more consciously, aware of her watching him. When the food was ready, he set a plate in front of her and took the other chair. They ate in silence at first, but eventually Celia spoke. "Mr. Bradley, I need to be honest with you. I have no money. My parents spent everything on the wagon and supplies. I have nothing to pay you with, no way to repay your kindness." "I do not want you to think I am trying to take advantage." "Stop," Thomas interrupted, setting down his fork. "I do not want your money. I made a promise to your mother, but even if I had not, I would not have left you there. It is not who I am." Celia's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. "Then what do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question, and Thomas wished he had a better answer. "I have not figured that out yet," he admitted, "but for now you can stay here. The cabin is not big, but I can sleep in the barn. You need time to grieve, to recover your strength, to figure out your next step. Consider this a safe place while you do that." "I cannot ask you to sleep in your own barn," Celia protested. "I can. It is already decided," Thomas said firmly. "You will take the cabin. I have spent plenty of nights in the barn before. It is no hardship." They finished the meal, and Thomas showed Celia where things were kept, how to work the pump outside for water, where the privy was located. Then he left her alone, sensing she needed time and space to process everything that had happened. He spent the day working around the ranch, mending tack, checking on the small herd of cattle grazing in the near pasture, splitting firewood for the coming winter even though autumn was still months away. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. When evening came, he knocked on the cabin door before entering to find Celia had tidied up, washed the dishes, swept the floor. She had also washed her face and hair with the water from the pump, and she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable without the dust and grime of the trail. "You did not have to do all this," Thomas said, though privately he was grateful for the effort she had made. "I need to earn my keep," Celia said simply. "I will not be a burden. If I am to stay here, even temporarily, I will work. I can cook, clean, sew, tend a garden. I grew up on a farm, Mr. Bradley. I'm not afraid of hard work." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding. You help with the household tasks, and I will provide room and board. But I want you to know this is not charity, and you are not a servant. You are a guest. A friend, I hope." "A friend," Celia repeated softly, testing the word. "I would like that. And please call me Celia. After everything, I think we are past formalities." "Then you should call me Thomas," he said. And when she smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he had found her, he felt his heart skip in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Thomas rose before dawn to tend the animals and ride the range, checking fences and water sources and watching for signs of predators or rustlers. Celia transformed the cabin from a bachelor's stark quarters into something approaching a home, adding small touches: wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains sewn from an old dress of her mother's, meals that were more than just fuel for the body. She worked tirelessly, as if activity could keep the grief at bay, and Thomas did not try to stop her. He understood that need to keep moving, to stay busy, to pretend the pain was not there nipping at your heels. But in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat together over supper or coffee, the walls they had built around themselves began to crack. They talked, hesitantly at first, then with increasing ease. Thomas told her about the war, about losing his parents to fever, about deciding to head west where the ghosts could not follow. Celia spoke of her childhood in Kansas, of the dreams she had harbored before life taught her that dreams were luxuries poor folk could not afford. They laughed together over small things: a story about a stubborn cow, a memory of a childhood mishap, and the laughter felt like medicine, like something they both desperately needed. Thomas found himself looking forward to those evening hours more than he cared to admit. He loved the sound of Celia's voice, The way her eyes lit up when she talked about something that interested her. The way she listened to him as if his words mattered. He loved coming back to the cabin at the end of a long day and finding the lamp lit in the window, smoke curling from the chimney, the promise of a meal and conversation and connection waiting inside. He was falling in love with her. He knew it, fought against it, told himself it was impossible, inappropriate, too soon. She had just lost everything. She needed stability, not the complications of romantic entanglement. But his heart did not listen to logic. His heart only knew that Celia Owens made him feel alive again, made him want things he had convinced himself he did not need. For her part, Celia was fighting her own battle. Guilt gnawed at her guilt that she could feel happy, even for moments when her parents were barely cold in their graves. Guilt that she found herself drawn to Thomas, that she noticed the strength in his shoulders, the kindness in his gray eyes, the gentle way he handled the horses. Her mother would have liked him, she thought, and that realization brought both comfort and fresh grief. She tried to tell herself that what she felt was gratitude, nothing more. Thomas had saved her life, given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. Of course, she felt grateful. But gratitude did not explain the way her pulse quickened when he walked into the room, or the way she found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch, or the way she dreamed about him at night, dreams that left her flushed and confused when she woke. 3 weeks after Celia had come to the ranch, a summer storm rolled through the territory, bringing thunder and lightning and a rare, precious rain that turned the parched earth to mud and sent the cattle into nervous huddles. Thomas was in the barn when Celia appeared in the doorway, soaked through despite the shawl she had pulled over her head. "One of the chickens got out," she said breathlessly. "I tried to catch her, but she ran toward the creek, and I was afraid she would drown if the water rises." Thomas was already moving, grabbing a rain slicker from a peg on the wall. "Stay here," he ordered, but Celia shook her head stubbornly. "I am not helpless," she said. "I can help. Look." They searched together in the driving rain, calling for the wayward hen, slipping in the mud, getting soaked to the skin. Finally, Thomas spotted the bird huddled under a bush and managed to grab her before she could dart away. He handed the squawking, indignant chicken to Celia, and they ran back to the barn, laughing despite the discomfort. Inside, they stood dripping and breathless, and suddenly the laughter died as their eyes met. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning still flashing outside. Thomas took a step closer, and Celia did not back away. His hand came up, almost of its own accord, to brush a wet strand of hair from her face. "Celia," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer hide. "I need to tell you something." "I know," she whispered, and the look in her eyes told him she did know, that she felt it too, this pull between them that grew stronger every day. "It has only been a few weeks," he continued, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "I know it is too soon, that you need time, that I have no right to ask anything of you, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel this way. You have turned my life upside down, Celia Owens. You have made me want things I thought I would never have: a wife, a family, a future that does not stretch out empty and alone. I am falling in love with you, and I do not know how to stop, and I do not know if I should." She kissed him then, rising up on her toes and pressing her lips to his, stopping the flow of words with the sweetness of her mouth. Thomas froze for a heartbeat, stunned, then wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back with all the longing and loneliness and hope that had been building inside him. The chicken squawked in protest, trapped between them, and they broke apart laughing, the tension shattered but the connection only stronger. "I love you too," Celia said, her hands fisted in his wet shirt, her forehead pressed against his chest. "I did not think I could feel this way, not now, not after everything. I thought there was something wrong with me for even thinking about you like that when I should still be mourning. But Thomas, you have given me hope again. You have shown me that life goes on, that it is possible to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. I do not want to fight this anymore. I do not want to pretend I do not love you." They stood there in the barn, holding each other while the storm raged outside and the animals shifted and snorted around them. And Thomas felt something deep inside himself unlock and open. This was what he had been missing, what all the land and cattle and hard work could never give him: this connection, this belonging, this sense of being truly seen and valued by another person. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised her. "I know it is fast. I know people will talk, but I do not care. I want you in my life, Celia, not as a guest or a housekeeper or someone passing through. I want you as my wife, my partner, my equal in everything. Will you have me?" Celia pulled back to look up at him, and he saw tears mingling with the rainwater on her face. "Are you certain? You barely know me. What if I am a terrible wife? What if you regret this?" "I am more certain of this than anything I have ever done," Thomas said firmly. "And I could never regret you." "Never? Then yes," Celia breathed. "Yes, Thomas Bradley, I will marry you." They rode into Bismarck the next morning, the sun bright after the storm, the world washed clean and new. The town was small, barely 24 buildings clustered around a crossroads, but it had what they needed: a general store, a saloon, a church with a circuit preacher who came through once a month. As luck would have it, Reverend Porter was in town that very day, preparing to move on to the next settlement on his route. The Reverend was a thin, serious man with kind eyes who listened to their story without judgment. "This is highly irregular," he said when they had finished explaining. "You have known each other less than a month. Are you certain you are not simply seeking companionship in the face of tragedy?" "I am certain I love her," Thomas said, meeting the preacher's gaze squarely. "I am certain I want to spend my life making her happy, protecting her, building a future with her. If that is not enough reason to marry, I do not know what is." Reverend Porter looked at Celia. "And you, young lady, you have suffered tremendous loss. Are you certain you are thinking clearly?" Celia lifted her chin, and Thomas felt a surge of pride at the strength in her voice when she answered. "My parents came west looking for a new beginning. They did not find it, but I have. Thomas is a good man, the best man I have ever known. I love him, and I want to be his wife. I am thinking more clearly now than I have in a long time." The preacher studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. If you are both certain, then who am I to stand in the way? Do you have witnesses?" They found 2 townspeople willing to serve a shopkeeper's wife, and a cowboy who was in town buying supplies, and the ceremony was brief and simple, conducted in the small church with its rough-hewn pews and simple wooden cross. Thomas did not have a ring, but he promised to get one, and Celia told him it did not matter, that she did not need symbols when she had his heart. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Celia with a tenderness that made the shopkeeper's wife sigh and dab at her eyes. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light, and this time, Thomas did not sleep in the barn. They came together that night with a mix of passion and gentleness, learning each other's bodies, whispering words of love and promise in the darkness. For Thomas, it felt like coming home after years of wandering. For Celia, it felt like being reborn, like the scared, grief-stricken girl who had been abandoned in the canyon had transformed into a woman with a purpose, a place, a person who loved her. The months that followed were the happiest of Thomas's life. He and Celia worked side by side to improve the ranch, building a larger chicken coop, starting a vegetable garden, adding a room onto the cabin so they would have more space. They talked about the future, about eventually expanding the herd, about maybe hiring a hand or two if the ranch continued to grow. They made love with increasing ease and joy, learning what brought each other pleasure, falling asleep tangled together every night. Celia bloomed under Thomas's love and the satisfaction of useful work. The shadows of grief slowly lifted from her eyes, though she never forgot her parents. She and Thomas rode out one Sunday to visit their graves, bringing wildflowers and spending time in quiet remembrance. Thomas stood with his arm around her shoulders, and when she cried, he held her, understanding that love and grief could coexist, that you could honor the dead while embracing the life they would want you to live. In October, Celia began to suspect she might be pregnant. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed, but as the signs became more certain, she found herself both excited and terrified. What if something went wrong? What if she lost the baby as her own mother had lost 2 children between conception and birth? What if she was not ready to be a mother? She finally told Thomas one evening after supper, the words rushing out in a nervous jumble. "I think I am with child. I am not completely certain, but all the signs are there, and I wanted you to know." Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, wonder, before settling on a grin so wide and genuine it took Celia's breath away. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the cabin until she was laughing and begging him to stop. "We are going to have a baby," he said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. "Celia, this is I never thought," words failed him, and he kissed her instead, pouring all his joy and love into the kiss. "You are happy then?" Celia asked when they finally broke apart, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given me everything, Celia. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." As winter set in and Celia's belly began to swell with new life, Thomas became almost comically protective. He insisted she not lift anything heavy, not work too hard, not do anything that might put stress on her or the baby. Celia tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding it came from love even when it drove her to distraction. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the baby's arrival, talking about names, speculating about whether it would be a boy or girl. Thomas built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs into the sides. Celia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands steady even as her heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. In late February of 1879, on a night when the wind howled around the cabin and snow piled against the walls, Celia went into labor. Thomas rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from Bismarck, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She arrived tired but competent, taking charge of the situation with brisk efficiency while Thomas paced and fretted. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas thought he might lose his mind from listening to Celia's cries and being unable to do anything to help. But as dawn broke and the storm finally exhausted itself, a new sound filled the cabin: the lusty wail of a newborn baby. "It is a boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a blanket and handing him to Thomas. "A big, healthy boy. Congratulations, Mr. Bradley." Thomas looked down at the red-faced, wrinkled creature in his arms and felt his heart expand to a size he had not known was possible. This was his son, his flesh and blood, a piece of himself and Celia combined into a whole new person. Tears streamed down his face unchecked as he carried the baby to where Celia lay exhausted but radiant in the bed. "Look what we made," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Look at him, Celia. He is perfect." Celia took their son in her arms, and the baby immediately quieted at the sound of her voice, his tiny fist waving in the air. "He looks like you," she whispered, tracing a finger over the baby's downy head. "Same shape to his face. What should we name him?" They had discussed many names over the winter, but in that moment only one felt right. "What about Matthew?" Thomas suggested. "It means gift from God, and that is what he is, Celia. A gift we did not think we would ever have." "Matthew Bradley," Celia said, testing how it sounded. "Yes. That is his name. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the world, little one." The arrival of their son changed everything and nothing. The ranch work still had to be done. The animals still needed tending, but now every task was performed with renewed purpose and energy. Thomas worked harder than ever, driven by the need to provide for his growing family, to build something that would last, something his son could inherit and be proud of. Celia adapted to motherhood with a combination of instinct and determination, nursing the baby, soothing him when he cried, marveling at every new sound and expression. They were tired, overwhelmed at times, but they were also happier than either had imagined possible. The cabin rang with baby laughter and cooing, with the sounds of a family learning to be a family. Thomas would come in from the range to find Celia singing to Matthew, her voice sweet and clear, and he would stand in the doorway just listening, his heart so full it almost hurt. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Thomas bought more cattle, hired a young cowboy named Jack to help with the increased workload, expanded the grazing area by purchasing adjacent land from a neighbor who had decided to move back east. The success felt earned, hard-won, and Thomas took satisfaction in knowing he had built it not just for himself but for his family. When Matthew was 2 years old, Celia became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. In the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Thomas's mother. The little girl had her mother's honey-colored eyes and a determined spirit that showed itself from the moment she entered the world. With 2 children, life on the ranch became even more chaotic but also richer. Matthew proved to be a gentle older brother, always wanting to help with the baby, bringing her toys and trying to make her laugh. Thomas and Celia worked as a team, supporting each other through the exhausting early years of parenthood, stealing moments alone when they could, still very much in love despite the demands on their time and energy. Years passed in a blur of growth and change. Matthew started learning to read from books Celia ordered from back east, showing an early aptitude for learning that delighted his parents. Sarah grew into a spirited little girl who loved following her father around the ranch, insisting she wanted to be a cowboy like him when she grew up. The ranch continued to expand and prosper, becoming one of the more successful spreads in the territory. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Celia into Bismarck and bought her the ring he had promised all those years ago, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light and sparkled like the tears in her eyes when he slipped it on her finger. "You did not have to do this," she said, though her voice was thick with emotion. "I told you I did not need a ring." "I know," Thomas said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing the ring. "But I wanted you to have it. I want the world to know that you are loved, that you are cherished, that you are the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store, and Celia reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Do you ever think about how we met? About how unlikely all of this was?" "All the time," Thomas admitted. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I can hear your mother's voice asking me to promise to take care of you. I like to think she knows I kept that promise." That I did more than just keep you safe. I loved you, built a life with you, gave her grandchildren she never got to meet. She would have loved you, Celia said softly. Both my parents would have. They would have been so happy to know I ended up with someone like you, that their deaths were not meaningless, that something good came from all that loss. Their deaths were not meaningless, Thomas said firmly. They brought you to me. They gave me you and Matthew and Sarah and this life we have built together. I would not trade it for anything. That night, after they returned to the ranch and put the children to bed, Thomas and Celia sat on the porch together, watching the stars come out over the dark shape of the distant mountains. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and the sound of cattle lowing in the near pasture. Thomas had his arm around Celia's shoulders, and she leaned into him, content and at peace. "Are you happy?" he asked, a question he sometimes still needed to hear answered even after 5 years of marriage. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Celia said without hesitation. "There are still days when I miss my parents, when I think about what might have been if things had gone differently. But then I look at you, at our children, at the life we have built here, and I cannot imagine it any other way. You saved me, Thomas. Not just my life that day in the canyon, but my spirit, my ability to hope and love and believe in the future. You gave me all of that." "You saved me too," Thomas said quietly. "Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live again, to dream again. You taught me that it is possible to be hurt and still open your heart, to lose everything and still find the courage to try again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Celia spoke again. "Do you think we will have more children?" Thomas looked down at her in surprise. "Do you want more, maybe?" she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I love being a mother, I love our family, and the ranch is doing well enough that we could support another child or two." "Then I think that sounds perfect," Thomas said, pulling her closer and kissing the top of her head. "However many children you want, Celia, however many we are blessed with." And they were blessed, as it turned out. Over the next several years, Celia gave birth to 2 more children, another son, Daniel, born in 1883, and a daughter, Emily, in 1885. The cabin had to be expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and Thomas built on 2 more rooms and a proper porch where the children could play. The ranch continued to thrive, and they hired additional help, including a housekeeper to assist Celia with the increased household demands. Through it all, Thomas and Celia's love for each other only deepened and matured. They had their arguments, of course, what married couple did not. But they learned to communicate, to listen, to compromise. They made a point of stealing time alone together, even if it was just a walk in the evening after the children were in bed or a few minutes in the morning before the household woke. Those moments of connection kept their bond strong even as the years and the demands of family life pulled them in different directions. The children grew, each developing their own personality and interests. Matthew inherited his father's love of the land and his mother's intellectual curiosity, spending hours reading books about ranching techniques and new agricultural methods. Sarah remained a tomboy, more comfortable in the saddle than the kitchen, though Celia made sure she learned the domestic skills she would need as well. Daniel was the quietest of the children, sensitive and artistic, always drawing pictures or making up stories. And Emily, the youngest, was pure sunshine, laughing and charming everyone she met. Thomas took immense pride in his children, but he never forgot that it all started with Celia, with that dusty afternoon when he had found her beside her dying mother in a canyon ravine. Sometimes, when the ranch work allowed, he would ride out to that place, which was not far from their northern boundary. The graves were still there, marked by the stones and weathered by time, and he always brought fresh flowers when he visited, a small way of honoring the woman who had entrusted him with her daughter's care, and in doing so, given him everything he had ever wanted. One year, when Matthew was about 12, he rode out with Thomas to visit the graves, wanting to know more about the grandparents he had never met. Thomas told him the whole story, holding nothing back: the wagon accident, the dying mother, the promise he had made, the way he and Celia had fallen in love. "That must have been scary for Mother," Matthew said thoughtfully, standing with his hat in his hands beside his grandmother's grave. "Being all alone like that." "It was," Thomas agreed. "But she was brave. She is still brave. Your mother is the strongest person I know, Matthew. Remember that. Strength is not just about physical power or never being afraid. It is about facing your fear and your pain and choosing to keep going anyway." "Is that why you married her?" Matthew asked. "Because she was brave." "I married her because I loved her," Thomas said. "But yes, her bravery, her strength, her kindness, all of that was part of why I fell in love. And I hope, when you are old enough to think about marriage yourself, you will look for those same qualities. Looks fade, sun and passion cools, but character endures. Find a woman of good character who loves you and whom you love in return, and you will have a good life." As the years turned into decades, Thomas and Celia aged gracefully together, their hair graying, their faces lining, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and hard living. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew richer, deeper, textured with shared memories and shared struggles and shared joys. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899 with a big party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from throughout the territory. Their children, now grown or nearly so, helped with the preparations. And the event was a testament to the life they had built, the connections they had made, the respect they had earned, the family they had created. At one point during the party, Thomas pulled Celia aside, leading her away from the crowd to the spot where they had first kissed in the barn all those years ago. "I wanted a moment alone with you," he said, taking both her hands in his. 20 years, Celia. 20 years since I found you in that canyon. 20 years since your mother asked me to take care of you. Do you think I have done a good job?" Celia laughed, tears springing to her eyes as they so often did these days. "Thomas Bradley, you have exceeded every expectation, every hope, every dream I could have had. You have given me a life beyond anything I imagined possible. You have been my partner, my love, my best friend. I could not have asked for more." "I was thinking," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper, "that we should write your parents a letter. Tell them about the life we have built, about their grandchildren, about everything that has happened. Then we can take it to their graves and read it to them." "I know it might sound strange, it sounds perfect," Celia interrupted, her voice choked with emotion. "It sounds exactly right." So together, over the next several days, they wrote a long letter to Margaret and Harold Owens, telling them about the 20 years that had passed since that terrible day in the canyon. They described the ranch, the children, the joys and sorrows they had experienced. They thanked them for bringing Celia west, even though it had cost them their lives, because without that journey, none of this would have happened. And they promised to continue living fully, to continue honoring the sacrifice that had brought them together. When the letter was finished, Thomas and Celia rode out to the graves one last time. The desert had reclaimed much of the area, but the stones still stood, and they spent an afternoon clearing away brush and weeds, making the site tidy again. Then, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the red rocks, Celia read the letter aloud, her voice steady and clear. When she finished, they stood in silence for a moment, then Thomas spoke. I promised I would take care of her, Margaret. I want you to know I kept that promise. I loved her with everything I had, and I will continue to love her for the rest of my life. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me this gift." They rode home as darkness fell, and that night they made love with the slow tenderness of people who knew every inch of each other, who had built a lifetime together, and looked forward to however many more years they would be granted. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Celia spoke into the darkness. "I used to have nightmares about that day in the canyon," she said quietly. "About being alone, about watching my mother die, about the fear and the despair. But I have not had those dreams in years, Thomas. Do you know why?" "Why?" he asked, his hand stroking her hair. "Because you took those memories and transformed them. You took the worst day of my life and made it the beginning of the best life I could have imagined. Every time I think about that canyon now, I do not think about death and loss. I think about the moment you came riding over that ridge. I think about how you saved me, how you loved me, how you gave me a future. You turned my tragedy into a love story." "We turned it into a love story," Thomas corrected gently. "Together. That is what we have always done best." Celia faced everything together and come out stronger on the other side. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. The children married and started families of their own, giving Thomas and Celia grandchildren to spoil and adore. The ranch passed to Matthew's management as Thomas slowed down, content to advise and support rather than do the day-to-day work. Celia focused on her grandchildren and her garden, finding satisfaction in the slower pace of life. But through it all, Thomas and Celia remained the center of the family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love story became family legend, told and retold to the grandchildren who clamored to hear about the day Grandpa found Grandma in the canyon and saved her life. On their 30th wedding anniversary, too old and creaky to throw another big party, Thomas and Celia celebrated quietly at home, just the two of them and their immediate family. After dinner, Matthew raised his glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us all what love looks like, what commitment means, what it takes to build a life worth living. You started with nothing but each other, and you created all of this family, this legacy, this love that will outlast all of us. Thank you for showing us the way." Thomas and Celia clasped hands under the table, their fingers intertwined as they had been for 3 decades, and looked around at the faces of their children and grandchildren. This was what they had built from the ashes of tragedy and loss. This was what that promise in the canyon had become. This was love, messy and complicated and beautiful and enduring. As the evening wound down and the family drifted away to their own homes, Thomas and Celia stood on the porch, looking out over the ranch that had been their life's work. The moon was rising over the mountains, huge and golden, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "You remember what you said to me that first night in the barn?" Celia asked, leaning against Thomas's solid warmth. "After we kissed and I told you I loved you." "I said a lot of things that night," Thomas said with a chuckle. "My brain was not working particularly well." "You said you wanted a wife, a family, a future that was not empty and alone," Celia reminded him. "Have you gotten what you wanted, Thomas Bradley?" Thomas turned to face her, cupping her face in his weathered, work-worn hands. "I got so much more than I wanted, Celia. I got you. I got our children. I got a life so rich and full that sometimes I can hardly believe it is real. I got 30 years of waking up next to the woman I love, of building something meaningful, of being part of something bigger than myself. If I died tomorrow, I would die a happy man, knowing I lived fully and loved completely." "Well, do not die tomorrow," Celia said, mocked sternly, though her eyes were soft. "I am not done with you yet, husband. We still have years ahead of us, and I intend to spend every single one of them with you." "That sounds perfect," Thomas said, and kissed her under the rising moon, surrounded by the land they had tamed together and the life they had built from nothing but love and determination, and the promise made beside a dying woman's bed 30 years ago. And it was perfect. Not perfect in the sense of being without difficulty or sorrow. Life was never that simple. But perfect in the way that mattered, in the sense that two people had found each other against all odds, had chosen to love each other despite their wounds and fears, and had built something lasting and good that would echo through generations. Thomas and Celia Bradley lived out the rest of their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They died within months of each other, Thomas in his sleep at the age of 81, and Celia following him that autumn, as if her heart had decided, like her mother's before her, that it could not go on without its other half. They were buried on the ranch, side by side on a hill overlooking the house and the land they had loved. And if you were to visit their graves today, you would see that they are well tended, with fresh flowers often resting on the simple headstones, because love like theirs does not die. It lives on in the stories passed down, in the legacy of family and hard work and never giving up, in the truth that even from the deepest tragedy, hope and love can bloom. The ranch remains in the family still, passed down through the generations, a testament to what two people can build when they commit to each other fully and without reservation. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the wind blows just right across the New Mexico desert, you can almost hear the echo of laughter from long ago, the sound of children playing, the murmur of two voices talking late into the night, the sounds of a love story that began in a canyon with death and despair, but became something beautiful and enduring, proof that even in the hardest times, love can find a way.